Hi, I am Gunther Verheyen. I call myself an independent Scrum caretaker. On a journey of humanizing the workplace with Scrum. As you might know, I like to read stuff for you. Several years ago, I've read the previous edition of my book Scrum Pocket Guide. I have read several articles from my book 97 Things Every Scrum Practitioner Should Know. Today I want to read something else for you. I have recently translated a part of a book that was written in Dutch into English. The book was written by Professor Kristien Hens and is called Denken met microben in Dutch. But I want to share my English translation with you. Kristien Hens is a full professor in bioethics at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Antwerp. Besides teaching about ethics, biology and the environment, Professor Hens is actively involved in multidisciplinary research regarding those topics. She has also performed influential work in the combined fields of the philosophy of psychiatry, mental health and neurodiversity. An interview with Professor Hens in the print version of my newspaper De Morgen on the 19th of April 2025 attracted my attention. It was an interview about her newest book called Denken met microben that was published in March 2025 by Belgian publishing house called Letterwerk. The interview as well as the book are in Dutch. Not having given it too much thought, I would intuitively translate the title of her book, described as an essay by the way, given its length and format. I would translate that as Thinking Microbes. The interview left me with high expectations and the determination to read the book. By coincidence, later that day, our son shared having noticed an interview with one of his lecturers in the online edition of my newspaper. My son studies philosophy at the University of Antwerp. The lecturer of the course called Japanese Philosophy and the Environment that he was referring to is Professor Hens. I shared my enthusiasm about the book with him and went out to buy it the next working day. Despite having tons of books I have and that I aspire reading, I decided to give priority to this one. Well, honestly, another reason might have been the prospect of meeting Professor Hens in person at an excursion she was organizing for my son's class by the end of April. I actually read the book while Professor Hens, my son and the rest of the class were visiting the Japanese gardens in Hasselt, Belgium. It totally lives up to my expectations. I found it insightful, inspiring, but also exhibiting a strong form of social commitment, the will to help create a better society and world. Although I am obviously active in a very different domain, I totally relate to this drive, as I call myself an independent Scrum caretaker on a journey of humanizing the workplace with Scrum. Furthermore, I found the essay to be clear, well articulated and straightforward in terms of style as well as content. Although it was also subtle, multi-layered and nuanced at the same time. I feel this book holds important insights scientifically as well as philosophically that counter the many overly simplistic ideas and opinions that circulate in society regarding evolution, life and what it means to be human. I totally support how Professor Hens wants to help her readers overcome the all too simplistic understanding and interpretations of Darwin and the theory of evolution that he unleashed onto the world. In one of her mails to me, Professor Hens stated that Darwin's views and text actually display a highly nuanced and even ecologically modern view on life on our planet. His ideas are so much richer than the traditional and simplistic reductionist representation of evolution as sexual reproduction and the power of the strongest. Although Charles Darwin said, and I quote, "It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most adaptive to change." Although Professor Hens seems rightfully critical to me about the closed stance of Professor Richard Dawkins as a scientist regarding new insights on what drives human beings, I felt she does reinforce the main message that I retained from reading The Selfish Gene by Dawkins. Here you see the Dutch translation of that, the zelfzuchtige gene, the selfish gene. The essential message of that book is that there are much more different and much more diverse tactics to survive than is typically acknowledged. Professor Hens playfully helps her readers transcend the false idea of life as merely a competition and a battle for dominance, a zero-sum game, and helps her readers come to see life as a social network of relationships, creative alliances, cooperations, and experiments. On a personal side note, I don't read Richard Dawkins' message in The Selfish Gene as one saying that our bodies are merely mechanistic vehicles for our genes. His views on epigenes as well as on the evolution and survival of what he calls memes, meaning cultural genes, contradict that for me certainly. From a philosophical point of view, it also would be, if that was the reading of his message, would be an alternative to the overly simplistic dualistic debate on body versus brain, heart versus soul, whatever. In her book, Professor Hens again playfully makes her readers think about our microbiome in that regard. Is our microbiome a part of us, or is it a separate organism residing in us, allowing both parties to benefit from the symbiotic cohabitation? By the way, Professor Hens also reminds us in her book about the close entanglement between our brain, our intestinal flora and gut microbiota, and our identity and personality. When I indeed met Professor Hens in person briefly after the mentioned excursion, I asked her permission to translate a part of her book. While autographing my copy, she granted me that permission and later on also assured me of her publisher's agreement. I'm humbled that Professor Hens allowed me to translate her words into English and share it with you. I see this translation as in line with my recent translation of the newspaper article Trans Women Are Women by Professor Rubeck, which I've also recorded, by the way, and which is also available on my YouTube channel. Both translations serve to share insights with my global network of readers and followers, insights that I consider as really important in overthrowing ingrained established cliches. In the specific effort of translating the words of Professor Hens, some selfishness played a role too. I decided to translate the article or the paragraph from her essay called Fascinated by a Blob, because it's about self-organization in nature, in particular the self-organization of slime molds. Anyone familiar with my work knows that I consider self-organization as the part of Scrum's DNA connected to the other part, meaning empiricism. So Scrum's DNA is self-organization and empiricism. The fact, by the way, that the sex life of slime molds connects nicely to my translation of the article regarding the rights of trans women of Professor Rubbeke is sort of a nice to have. I've also extended my translation of that chosen paragraph of Professor Hens's book with elements from the next paragraph of the essay. The next paragraph that was called Minakata Kumakusu and a different view on science. As a headline for the interview with Professor Hens, the newspaper quoted her saying, and I've translated it into English, when you die, your microbiome lives on. Life goes on in cycles of connections and transformations. That's beautiful. That in turn reminded me of a quote of the character Dom on planet Gaia in the novel Foundation's Edge of Isaac Asimov. Dom said in that book, but all things recycle. We must eat, and everything we can eat, plants as well as animal, even the inanimate seasonings, are part of Gaia. Then too, what is eaten remains, after all, part of the planetary consciousness. When I die, I too will be eaten, even if only by decay bacteria, and I will then participate in a far smaller share of the total. But someday, parts of me will be parts of other beings, parts of many. I hope you'll enjoy listening to my translation of the article of Professor Hens. It's called Fascinated by a Blob. Once you start thinking like American evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis and her bacteria, you will find that besides competition, collaboration is fundamental for the coming into existence of both specific species as well as life in general. Margulis, however, was not the only scientist who allowed microscopically tiny forms of life to lead us toward new insights. More researchers developed fresh and refreshing perspectives by observing what seem as futile organisms, like slime molds. Who knows, maybe during a walk in nature you might have seen a slime mold, like the strikingly yellow-colored species that goes by the name of scrambled egg slime. It's called Fuligo septica in Latin. It is a blob-like organism that can emerge in a very short span of time, seemingly out of nowhere. It is difficult to correctly classify them. It proves already difficult to even consider them as either unicellular or as multicellular, because it depends on your point of view. Some slime molds form what is called a plasmodium, an agglutination of cells that look like a moving blob of slime. Cellular slime molds, on the other hand, lump together, while at least partially still retaining a sense of individuality. slime molds appear to be deceptively simple. While not having a brain or a central nervous system, experiments show that they are surprisingly intelligent. They navigate effectively through the environment in which they live. They find sources of food through chemical detection, and they take complex decisions. They are able to find the shortest route to food through a maze or a labyrinth, and are even more efficient at it than human beings are. They construct ingenious network structures to transport food in a phenomenon that is called the Paris syndrome. That's because the created structure visually resembles the underground Paris metro system. But in a remarkable endeavor of bioengineering, a group of scientists even built on the slime mold's ability to create efficient networks to simulate and ultimately design the Tokyo rail system. So the structure of the Tokyo rail system is based upon insights from slime molds finding their way towards their food and transporting it. On top of that, slime molds show much versatility. In times of drought, they shrink to re-emerge later. Their sex life is not less remarkable. Some slime mold species can take on up to 720 genuses. Their genital cells appear in many different combinations that define which individuals can mate. Overall, their intelligence as well as their reproductive ways are fascinating, although much remains unknown of slime mold. The way that they cut through existing ideas on genus intelligence and classification offers important insights and lessons regarding life in general. Insights and lessons that are too beautiful to leave unexplored. Evelyn Fox Keller, an American physicist and science philosopher, was one of those scientists who was open to be inspired by slime mold. At the beginning of her career, Keller operated at the intersection of physics and biology. Gradually, she expanded her focus towards research by female scientists, research that was often taken less seriously and remained under-highlighted despite the fascinating findings and results. Keller emphasized, for instance, the importance of the work of Barbara McClintock. McClintock was a groundbreaking geneticist who had discovered and described in the 40s and the 50s of the previous century how certain genes in corn could move through the genome, so-called transposons. At first, the findings of McClintock were ignored, even rejected, as they did not fit the by then ruling genetic paradigm. But ultimately, in 1983, she was granted the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for that discovery of genetic transposition. To date, she remains the only woman who has received an unshared Nobel Prize in that category. Evelyn Fox Keller went through similar experiences in her research of slime molds. During and following her graduation in molecular biology, she became fascinated by the way that these organisms, slime molds, organized themselves. To dig deeper, she started to collaborate with mathematician Lee Siegel on it. Slime molds tend to live as unicellular organisms when the circumstances are more harsh, but clump together when the circumstances change. They then purposefully aggregate into a sort of blob, a structure that is somewhere between what we would call an individual on the one hand or a community on the other hand. For a long time, scientists around the world believed that a small number of pacemaker cells coordinated this clumping phase by sending out signals to the other cells. Yet, despite thorough research and investigations, the existence of such bossy cells, coordinating cells, was never established. Keller and Siegel therefore suggested a different explanation. What if those unicellular unicellular organize themselves using local interactions and capitalizing on the right circumstances? What if this process requires no central steering via pacemakers or otherwise? Mathematical models that show how simple units can self-form into complex shapes without central steering or coordination already existed. For many biologists, however, the application of this idea in nature was beyond their comprehension and belief, beyond the ruling paradigm. Yet, bottom-up self-organization became an accepted concept in many disciplines, including biology. It changed our views of complex systems exhibiting complex behaviors, and how such systems become. A major insight resulting from the work of Keller and Siegel is that complex systems do not necessarily need a leader, a boss, or any form of centralized coordination. This is not just relevant for biology, but it also offers an inspiring metaphor for human behavior. It shows that individuals and communities can independently grow and flourish without the prerequisite of centralized internal or external control. A hopeful thought in times when group dynamics are often considered only through the lens of polarization and conflict, which by the way is the core belief of the neo-Darwinist movement. Next to the work of Lynn Margulis, Barbara McClintock and Evelyn Fox Keller, I have been much inspired by Minakata Kumagusu. He was a Japanese naturalist and mycologist living during the Meiji Restoration period. I owe it to Japanese philosopher Eiko Honda that I got to know this fascinating scientist. After his return from studying and working in the US, Kumagusu developed a more open view on science and civilization by integrating ideas and beliefs from Asian philosophy and history. He considered slime molds to be a great example of fluidity, adaptability, and transcendence of pigeonholing, thereby showing how life does not fit rigid binary categories. Kumagusu saw in slime molds the confirmation of life as a holistically and symbiotically interwoven whole, which was closely connected to his belief on what science should be, a collaborative process integrating both human as well as non-human players, up to the world, the planet, the environment. That helps us transcend the idea that evolution and survival are only achieved through competition, exclusion, or replication of genes. Not all activities or events need have such a strict utilitarian purpose. Activities or events that lack a clear reproductive purpose can easily be seen as important for reinforcing relationships, networks, pleasure, mutual benefits, and ultimately even as a creative expression of life in itself. Fascinating examples of such type of activities, not easily fitting into the mechanistic views on evolution, are the development of human language or the female orgasm. Slime molds challenge us to rethink what life is and how life can be organized. They show us that simplicity and complexity exist in each other's vicinity even when we are not aware of it. And ultimately they might teach us that life does not just advance through battle and competition, but prospers through connection, creativity and shared success, even in a bright yellow blob. Now allow me to share a little bit about Professor Kristien Hens. Professor Kristien Hens is a full professor at the Department of Philosophy of the University of Antwerp. She holds a PhD in biomedical sciences, bioethics, and a PhD in philosophy. She is recognized for her contributions to bioethical debates, where she draws from her extensive interdisciplinary work in the fields of the ethics and philosophy of neurodiversity, particularly autism and ADHD, genetics, reproductive medicine, disability studies, feminism and biological concepts, complemented with insights from Asian philosophy. She has authored and edited several books, including Towards an Ethics of Autism, Chance Encounters, and recently Denken met microben. She has also authored or contributed to several other publications and papers. I hope you liked my translation. I hope it gave you some ideas about the power and the potential of self-organization and how self-organization happens in nature. Thank you very much.